Violence is a global phenomenon, and South Africa is no exception to it. Particularly, gender-based violence is an unrelenting assault on human dignity, depriving people of their human rights. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ginger, the founder of Ginger the Voice. We are a communications company that seeks to give hope, courage, and enlightenment. We do this through various platforms such as speaking, singing, and hosting talk shows. So once again, we are at your doorstep tonight, excited by the topic that we have, and also very happy to have Crispin J.R. Phiri, who's a spokesperson for the Ministry of Justice and Correctional Services. Thank you so much also, ladies and gentlemen, for being patient with us yesterday. We know that we flight our talk shows every Wednesday at 7 o'clock, but this week we had to have a change because of a few challenges. But Ginger the Voice wants to say thank you to you for being committed to us and coming through on a day that is not the usual in the normal day. Crispin, thank you so much for coming through to Ginger the Voice. Welcome to our show tonight.
Thank you for having me, and good evening to our viewers and listeners. It's an interesting platform, and I hope that we can have good conversations about how the criminal justice system can respond to gender-based violence.
And we must say that we're excited to see young blood, and we're hoping for fresh ideas and the energy that comes with the young blood. So we are hopeful. When we heard that you're part of it, we were like, okay, maybe our government is on the right track. But Crispin, without wasting time, we want to know from you. You know, we all know the formal definition of gender-based violence. But today, can you just give us a layman's term? When you say gender-based violence, you know, what is that?
Well, it's actually a good way of starting this because I think often we don't have an appreciation really of what gender-based violence is. And as a male, I should also say that I speak from a perspective of male privilege. So I might be one of the guilty ones here. But generally, when we speak of gender-based violence, we speak of crimes that are committed against people who are in a vulnerable position most of the time. And in the South African parlance, most of the time, this finds expression. A man and woman relationship, and also a domestic setting, a domestic family setting. And also children also do often bear the brunt of gender-based violence. So generally, we're talking about an imbalance in gender relations and where the one party exercises more power over the other. Also, in the queer community, we do find instances of gender-based violence. And that's why I say primarily when we speak of gender-based violence, it's something that occurs in a domestic setting, not necessarily between people who are in the same relationship. Sometimes it's an uncle and a niece or vice versa, but always there's some unequal relation to each other, and that's the conditions upon which gender-based violence most obviously and most prevalently finds expression in South Africa.
Wow. So are you saying to me what we read in terms of it being the prevalent types being violence against women and girls, and also violence against LGBTQI, are those the primary ones?
And those are the ones that are primarily, yes, in the public domain. But I mean, there are instances as well where men get abused by women. And there's also various strands of abuse. We speak of physical abuse, violent abuse. We also speak of emotional abuse as well, and financial abuse. For instance, people might not categorize as a form of gender-based violence, but not paying maintenance for your child is actually something that can be akin to gender-based violence, because ultimately one person is burdened with bringing up a child financially, emotionally, physically, and so on. And you have an agreement to ensure that this doesn't happen. But unfortunately, we do have instances where most prevalently men choose not to maintain their kids. And that also can be actually elevated to a form of financial abuse and ultimately a form of gender-based violence as well.
Okay, well, on the financial abuse side, I'm very interested to know, you find that in relationships, whether a boyfriend, girlfriend, or a husband and wife, you find that the woman, most of the times, they demand money or material things that a man cannot provide at that point in time. Would that also consist of gender-based violence? because from that they would get obviously to be emotionally abused.
I think, well, relationships by their nature is give and take, and so let's say you demand a Brazilian weave from your lover, and he can't afford it. It would be hard to say that that's a form of gender-based violence. That's what you expect from him, and if he cannot provide it, then that's part of the gives and takes of your relationship. But I wouldn't say that's a form of gender-based violence. But another example of gender-based violence is in the religious space, for instance, where
Yeah.
we would see that a pastor would say, for you to get blessings, you must give
Secretly.
me your monthly salary, you know. And often that is also a condition that is mostly prevalent between for some strange reason, women are most oftenly affected by such a space. So that's a form of religious abuse, where because of the authoritative figure of a religious leader, then someone is exploited with the threat of an omnipotent God striking you down if you don't follow the commands of a particular prophet or a particular religious leader. So that's also a form of gender-based violence that we see in our community. So I think to the extent where someone tries to extract something from you and there are different power relations with a very harsh condition to it, that's when the conversation around abuse, then starts manifesting itself.
I think on the part where you were saying that it's mostly women who are affected or rather victims of gender-based violence, we're not saying that, we're not taking away the fact that men are also at some point in time also victims. But talking about that, I know that the government in 2020 in August, you guys recommitted to fighting and eradicating gender-based violence by amending certain bills, and also what I noted, one of the events that were approved was, I think it was the releasing of women's rights for an equal future. So you'd run it the whole of August month. Now, my question to you, Crispin, is what is the government doing? Besides all these annual events that are happening, which we do appreciate as the larger African community, but what question is now, what else are the government doing to ensure that protection is ensured throughout the year? Protection is ensured and support is given throughout the year, not just annual events that do happen that create awareness. What else is done except for the August month?
I think the starting point is maybe to concede that, yeah, in terms of government programming, the month of August and also 16 days of activism against women and children are used to really profile government policy on gender-based violence, on gender equality as well. It being Women's Month, and you'd know that it's a good month for the government to really showcase what they're doing in terms of gender equality, and therefore the discussion and debate around gender-based violence then find expression. But the second starting point also is to look at gender-based violence itself and its characteristics. And gender-based violence does occur 365 days a year in any household. And it occurs in a household, in a private setting between two individuals. And in a way, the criminal justice system in particular can only be reactive because it's actually a societal problem. It's actually goes to the core of how we are brought up sometimes to think that a man is more superior to a woman, so therefore what the man says goes. That's the type of society that we have. And so gender-based violence most often finds expression in such patriarchal settings. And that's what we require the whole of society to assist us with. But what government can do is, when the incident of gender-based violence has actually manifested itself, is to ensure that those who find themselves in the parlance of the criminal justice system are effectively dealt with, are effectively isolated from the community, so that they can serve as an example for other people in our communities that is not the type of society that we want to build. But in our everyday discourse and in our everyday lives, we all collectively, outside of government, have an obligation to really reorientate, particularly young boys, around how we treat women, around how we particularly want, what type of society that we want. So what do we mean by gender equality? and young men should not be threatened by powerful women and by the concept of gender equality. And in some ways, truth be told, our constitution has brought that type of society to come about. But some of the consequences is that maybe in some ways, because of the old order of society, maybe in some instances now men begin to feel threatened by the concept of gender equality, and that has its own consequences. And so part of the development of our society requires us to really look at our school curriculum as to how we really orientate the girl child and the boy child around matters of gender-based violence. But from a criminal justice system point of view, there is a lot of room for us to improve to ensure that when these incidents do occur, the criminal justice machinery is relatively and efficiently responsive to these incidents. And we are actually starting to see some fruits in that regard. We've seen a number of cases that come before the courts where we are dealing with an incident of rape. A number of sentences we see are at a minimum life, 1 life sentence and so on, which is a good start. But we must not, as a collective society, throw our hands only to the justice system. I think we as all need to collectively look at different ways around how we can have these conversations around what gender equality means and how we want everyone to be treated in society. We also see this concerns around how we treat each other as humans first. You have the rise of Afrophobia in South Africa, and I call it particularly Afrophobia because I don't think it's xenophobia. So you don't see us chasing a Frenchman down the road because he's from France. It's specifically Black Africans that we have a problem with. You also see this in the way we treat people from the queer community as well. So there is and even we're also starting to see a lot of racist tropes starting to find expression in society. So there are a number of things that really show you that for us to have a proper cohesive society from a gender perspective right up to a racial perspective, a number of social programs really need to start taking place amongst ourselves, and our humanity as a whole needs to improve.
Okay, I like the fact that you pointed out that empowering both the girl and the boy child, because you find that we've got a lot of empowering systems, which are not yet enough, I say, that empower and look after the girl child. Now leaving behind the boy child, and now we're going to have, at some point in our future, we're going to have to play catch up again with the boy child. And I'm glad that you spoke of both empowering the girl child and the boy child. Now, talking about, schooling people and creating awareness on gender equality, I do know that I think in 2019, December, you launched, your ministry launched a Under the Tree dialogue for men and boys, which is aimed at obviously, changing their belief and attitudes towards gender equality. Can you tell us more about this? What is it all about, and what have you done in South Africa to make sure that it is planted or it is launched around the entire country? And how far has it gone? What are the good things that have come out from it? Because we need to run away from a point where we create so many social clubs, which social clubs or support systems or awareness, support systems. Let me put it that way: support systems, where we end up now not having support systems that will actually do the job and do the work. We want to see fruit out of this whole creation of all these societies. So what has this particular Under the Tree dialogue for boys and men done for our men in terms of empowering them on gender equality across South Africa?
Yeah, it's a very important program, Men Under the Tree Dialogues, and the starting point that it begins from is the fact that men primarily are the problem when it comes to gender-based violence. And so to really mobilize men from various communities, from various social clubs, might I add, actually. So for instance, men in soccer clubs or men in the traditional communities, often we have what we call in traditional communities, khoro, or I'm not sure in Zulu if there's a khoro arrangement, but something to that effect where men gather and to then start introducing new conversations in those spaces. So for instance, one of the most common things that men would say when we gather, colloquially and very loosely, not conscious of what we are saying, we would say something like, "I, if ufuna lo mntwana lo umshaya ngama-BI 5 bese uzoba
Ooh,
right, then you get what you
ooh,
want." Something that's commonly said amongst men, but you
mm,
understand the commodification of women. Firstly, is highlighted there, that you can buy sex anytime you want with a woman,
oof,
and or you can get her drunk, and then she's easy game. Those are the type of conversations that we really seek to delineate and hone in on in those forums, to say, but actually what you're saying here is that, you can buy a woman, or you can, buying her beer is the end all and be all of it.
mm,
And the type of conversations that we introduce in those spaces to really start probing at some of the patriarchal stereotypes that men have of women themselves. Um, Unfortunately, COVID has been highly destructive, and so we're not
yeah,
able to have these gatherings as much. And this interview is sort of testament to that. Now we have actually evolved, and we have hybrid interviews,
mm,
but difficult to have those type of conversations in a meaningful way in this type of format. I think it's something that we're still trying to configure, especially in the type of communities that we want to have these conversations in. So what it also has entailed is that, for instance, we have had a sort of a hotspot approach. Before, it was called a hotspot approach, where we looked at where is the prevalence in terms of our court statistics of the number of gender-based violence incidents. So, for instance, in Gauteng, there's an area towards the north of Gauteng called Hammanskraal. And we had seen that actually there's been a high level of gender-based violence activities in this area, according to our own court statistics. So we then said, as part of us having sort of a proactive approach, instead of just having a legislative approach, which is reactive in nature, let's start introducing the Men Under the Tree dialogues in those areas.
okay,
And the feedback was quite interesting. In some instances, we then even brought in offenders, ex-offenders, who have committed these crimes and who have been rehabilitated and have been sort of refreshed. And
mm,
um, use a Bible analogy, since we just come from Easter's, they've been re-baptized and they're now reborn.
mm,
And for them to give the perspective of actually also what goes through their minds when they had committed these offenses and these types of crimes,
mm,
and you get insight into the type of socialization that they had. And so it's, in essence, Men Under the Tree Dialogues is a socialization program to somehow deal with how men are socialized around women. Interestingly, I think this year would have been a very interesting year to have the Under the Tree Dialogues, because the governing party is commemorating 150 years of Charlotte Maxeke.
yes,
And Charlotte Maxeke,
yes,
for instance, is the first Black female South African with a BSc degree.
mm,
We
mm,
don't idolize women enough in this country. And I think that's also something that we should be able to do a lot more. And that's also how you show that women are competent. Women have been competent. Women have been leading society in fields
absolutely.
that we cannot comprehend. And so things like that go a long way in really reorientating society and socializing young men to say, I want to be like Charlotte Maxeke, I want to have a BSc degree, instead of saying I want to be like Dr. Kumalo. No offense to him, but teaching young boys to also idolize very competent women in our
Mm.
society.
Because we do have them, quite a number of them. There's viewers comment here, and they want to remain anonymous. They're saying that why is it that gender-based violence is only recognized when violence is against women only? What about men who suffer in silence, especially in the workplace, on a manager and subordinate relationship, and also intimate relationships on a wife and husband or boyfriend and girlfriend relationship? He says that you find that women demand money from a man who's unable to give more than they can, and this should be deemed as gender-based violence because it leads to depression. Hence, a lot of men commit suicide. Ooh, quite a long comment slash question. So here's a viewer. I'm assuming that it's a male because of what he has written. So should I read it again for you?
No, I got it.
Hmm.
I think one of the problems in society is it's patriarchy itself, right? So men don't come out and say, "This is what I'm experiencing in my relationship, and it's not working out. I feel abused." I think often men, if the men do that, they are laughed at and they are shunned in our very own communities. It's not a function of legislation, it's a function of society. And in fact, the term gender-based violence itself is neutral, but we've abrogated it to mean only violence against women
Women.
because of the pattern in society. But actually, it's a neutral term. Gender-based violence means a violence against another gender, period. And it doesn't actually assume a nomenclature of a woman or a nomenclature of a man. But it's true, we do have patterns in society. In fact, strong indications are in society that men who are abused do not come out and mention that they are abused. Also in the queer community, there are conversations amongst queer people that, actually maybe we don't speak very often about the abuse that happens in the queer community. But that's also because of the broader consequences of society as well. So even the way we look at the queer community, you would think, what? How do you guys abuse each other? You would say, people would say such stereotypical comments. In the case of men, umfazi ukushaya kanjani? Or umfazi, how is a woman defeating you psychologically or something like that? So it's a function of our greater society. And I think the way to normalize it is almost like what we had done with HIV and AIDS. Once upon a time, saying that you are HIV and AIDS really brought you're HIV and AIDS positive, you're HIV positive rather, or you got AIDS, really brought you a great level of stigma in society instead of help. And I think we need to look at it from that perspective to say, well, this is how we dealt with it. Come out and say, I'm in an abusive relationship, and that's actually the problem. The problem is not the gender that's abusing you. It's the fact that you are in an abusive relationship and you need some level of help. And that's the only way that we can all help you. But if you don't come out that you are in an abusive relationship, because of the domestic nature of it as well, these things happen literally behind closed doors. In some instances, not just behind closed doors, but behind closed doors and very high fences. And I mean that in the literal sense, because there's also an assumption that gender-based violence is of a specific race, or it happens between specific people only. It happens across all races. Quite an indiscriminate pandemic, if we can call it. And if we're not coming out to say this is the type of abusive relationship that I'm in, then help would be quite a long way as well.
Okay, so but what we want to know is, so what is then government doing? For example, under the tree dialogue that we were just spoken about, what are you doing to ensure that men start speaking up? What awareness are you creating? Because with HIV and AIDS, there were awareness campaigns. It was at schools. It was everywhere. You just went on billboards, everywhere where you went. So what are you doing as the government to make sure that men start to speak up? Because this gentleman here, I assume, who wrote this is because he's even saying that this leads to depression. Hence, a lot of men commit suicide. So what are we doing as government to ensure that we create awareness that speaking up is actually more effective than just dying in silence?
Well, I think firstly, ensuring that the criminal justice system would be reactive enough. And by that, I mean, for instance, training police officers not to discriminate on people who come forward to say, this is the type of abuse that I have in my relationship. And that's the difficult part that we are still working on. I think the police can report better on the level of progress around retraining police officers to ensure that they are gender sensitive. So that's ensuring that our criminal justice systems has some level of gender sensitivity. And by that, I mean understanding the type of problem that we are dealing with here. Then, like you've highlighted, the Under the Tree dialogues is also part of that, ensuring that we unroll these programs where we also explain to men that, look, you have to speak out in the workplace. You would have your sexual harassment policies, which apply regardless of what your gender is. And I think people are aware of those, and they must not be afraid to exercise those rights. But in behind closed doors in our community spaces, the stigma is not a government stigma primarily. It is a societal stigma. And I think conversations like this really do help, going a long way to say, actually, the problem is not what my gender is, but it's the fact that I'm in an abusive relationship. And I should be able to speak out about that. I think these type of programs go a long way, but also with the Department of Women, and they are engaged in a number of programs around gender-based violence. We also have a national strategic plan on gender-based violence, which looks at various components. Some literally includes building a sexual offences court, which is orientated towards really making the justice system a lot more victim-centric. In some instances, we speak of having gendered spaces where at least people are able to really feel that they're able to express themselves, regardless of what their orientation is. So that plan is being implemented by the various facets of government, and we hope that society can respond and say that work here or this plan works there. And we also hope that soon society will be able to see the fruits of those plans, because I know one of the criticisms of government is that they are great plans, but we never see the implementation of their fruit. So that those are things that we're really honing into.
Okay. I also have another viewer's comment. This viewer is saying one form of gender-based violence is sexual violence. It's interesting to note that some women have used their sexual relations with men as to get a promotion or money. They do this by reporting false sexual violence, and then in brackets he writes rape, whereas that there was consent. For example, a manager and a subordinate. The lady will claim to be a rape victim because the male manager refused to give him a promotion or money. How can men be vindicated in such scenarios?
Well, it's a difficult question that there's no template also to say that this is how you can protect yourself from that form of it's work, essentially. But the opposite is also true, that what we do see a lot is that you do have instances of people in powerful positions preying on subordinates in promise of better working conditions or better anything. And that is, again, I'm being deliberate about not saying men and women, but the problem here with gender-based violence is that there's always a hierarchical relationship. Someone in a powerful position using their power inappropriately for their own private benefit at the exploitation of somebody else. And that's really what it comes down to.
Okay. All right. I'm just getting a lot of, I think people are very excited about this topic, because I'm getting a lot of viewers comment that says, what can I do if the person abusing me is my guardian? If I tell on them, I will lose the opportunity to go to school. Ooh, okay, that's a tough one.
Yeah. So we do have a gender-based violence hotline, which is 0800 GBV. And that number, you can report anonymously that this is what I'm going through, and they would be able to investigate the matter from a social development perspective, actually, not actually even from a criminal justice point of view. And if you're required to then be moved to a specific shelter or a particular intervention is required, then that hotline, I think, would be an appropriate place to really take this up, because that does sound like an element of social development to it, where it's in the guardian space where a minor has been exploited, and really not just the intervention of the criminal justice system, but to some extent some psychological and social work intervention as well. I just want to make sure I got the hotline right, so I'll just quickly, but you can, if those of us who have access to Google and stuff, if you Google GBV hotline, it should come up, but it's a very straightforward number. Yeah, now it's correct. It's 0800 GBV. So it's 0800 428 428.
Okay. All right. A question I have, earlier on you were talking about churches being one society or one part of society where you find that gender-based violence happens a lot, especially between pastors, etc. And there's a comment by Musa Amini saying that it's such a pity that gender-based violence has increased some churches as well, casting a bad shadow over the image of the church as a whole. Definitely, it's quite a bad thing, because we know church is a place where we run to for hope and for courage and also for protection. But nowadays things are different. So, in the light of knowing this as a the justice system, knowing that there are churches that abuse people, there are churches that are just not doing the Lord's work, what are you doing, to ensure that our society is kept, away from the charlatans, these people who are, oppressors in a way to our people? What is the criminal justice system doing about it?
Yeah, so it's an interesting space in that government doesn't regulate churches. So you won't have a situation where we're going to put up a list one day, we'll say, maybe government should regulate churches. That's another
I was
debate
about to say, it's
we should have.
definitely, Crispin, because
And you have,
sorry, Crispin, you know why I really think it's quite an important thing that you could also be our voice as a society. Every other sector is regulated. You go into the health sector, there's regulations. You go into HR space, there's regulations everywhere. Government should take note and run to this thing, because it has had a lot of bad, negative impact on our people. So I think I want to emphasize the point that, can we not get to a point where we now stop having a dialogue about government regulating churches, and government begins to actually regulate churches, because it's becoming now an urgent matter.
So, but some people might not agree with you, because people would say you have the right to religion, and government should not tell me how I exercise my right to religion. But we do have a commission responsible for sort of overseeing how religions and linguistics gets promoted in South Africa, and they're running interesting inquiries at the moment. And we really look forward to their report around what they find in the religious space, because indeed, correct, we are seeing various acts of abuse, particularly in the churches, manifesting themselves. And that's something that we want to look into. But we've also then presented to Parliament what we call the Domestic Violence Amendment Bill. And in it, we introduced a new concept of spiritual abuse. And in that, you can then go to any court in the long run and say, I would like the protection order against this individual because he's abusing me spiritually. And then you would detail what that spiritual abuse entails, and then according to the act, and then you would be able to get recourse from the law. So we have noted that the prevalence of gender-based violence and domestic violence, particularly in the church setting, does warrant some level of legislative intervention. But why I said we don't regulate churches is that because people would still go to church. And I think there's still that obligation on active citizenship to realize that, no, if I go to a particular church and I'm required to do something that really goes against my conscience, then maybe I should just take a step back and really think about whether this is truly what I want for me from a religious perspective. And we've seen it, right from people being required to eat grass to people doing sexual and doom. And there's been the latest one recently as well, where you ask yourself, what is this in terms of spirituality as well? But there's a realm that I'm not maybe qualified to express myself on. But I think have a show on that. Say, should we regulate religion? And you would see the interesting views from society as well around it. But granted that the Domestic Violence Amendment Bill introduced a provision around spiritual abuse. And just to explain that, it's a bill currently that has been debated by Parliament, and Parliament have called for inputs. I hope that some of our viewers and listeners have been able to input into the bills. And I think Parliament, when they have finalized those bills, would then further debate them in the House, and finally it will become an act of law. And that domestic violence bill also introduces a instrument to enable people to actually apply for protection orders online. So in the current status quo now, as we speak, if you have to, or if I have to go get a protection order, I'd have to go literally all the way to a police station and re-explain what has happened to me. And it really takes a long time. And sometimes it constitutes what we call secondary victimization, because sometimes I have to relate my story again to a second and third person for me to really explain what has happened. So now we've introduced an instrument where you are able to apply for your protection order online, and we think that at least would reduce secondary victimization, but also makes the criminal justice system a lot more efficient.
Okay. One thing I wanted to find out from you, we talked about the LGBTQI society, where they also felt that they are being, at some point, being victims. And you also spoke about the government working with churches. I've read an article on that one of the plans is for government to work with churches. How are you planning now to work with churches? Because there are some churches who are not necessarily agreeing with the LGBTQI society in terms of their morality and the ethics and that kind of thing or spirituality. How are you going to get, for example, Pentecostal churches to work with you regarding the LGBTQI? What is the plan? Remember that their premise is that it is ungodly. It is not according to the Bible. So how are you guys planning? How is the justice system planning to work with such churches that are actually against LGBTQI?
Well, our plan is not to regulate, to not, I wouldn't say regulate, but it's not to dictate to churches
Sure.
what their doctrines should be,
Yeah.
because that also revolves around the right to religion and how you want to
Absolutely.
religion. But to help educate society, not necessarily about the queer community, but just how
Yeah.
gender-based violence manifests itself in our communities, because we are seeing that it also manifests itself in the church as well, and then to a large extent in the communities. But to the extent that queer people are also being discriminated against because they're queer in certain settings, not just churches. It's a prevalent, and some people we have seen in some spaces would say they cannot get married at a certain place because this place doesn't recognize queer people. And we've seen examples of how such institutions have actually been taken to the South African Human Rights Commission quite successfully. So I think my advice would be, to the extent that someone experiences that specific form of discrimination, their refuge can be a Chapter 9 institution, the South African Human Rights Commission, which really has been quite effective in resolving matters of that nature, hate crimes, where we've seen, for instance, people being referred to as monkeys. It's been that institution that has gone on to really bring urgent applications to the Equality Court. We have an Equality Court that really ensures that people, regardless of their sexual orientation, race, or gender, are treated equally in any setting.
Okay. Tell me, Crispin, do you by any chance feel, as you've been working hands-on, in this sector, the Justice Ministry, so you have had first-hand experience working obviously with the victims and also the perpetrators of violence. Do you feel that, particularly between men and women, do you feel that the reason why men, you find them being the perpetrators and those who are basically causing pain to women? Is it because, particularly in the black people space, is it because of the lobola? Do they feel now that because I have lobolaed her, I am now in charge of her? Do they see women as objects? What causes that? We need to understand how the men thinks.
I wouldn't want to make it a racial problem, like a black man issue. I think it's definitely not a black man issue.
Sure.
I can give you an example of how patriarchy over the past many years has manifested itself. So, for example, the example of Charlotte Maxeke being a BSc graduate, she's one of very few women, let alone black women, who are BSc graduates, because even the government of the time had literally legislated women out of society. So the idea that women are good enough to only raise children, for instance, in the Afrikaans community, there's an interesting concept called a mansoek degree. So they would say to women, no, you don't go to varsity to study BSc and economics and so on. Go and study arts, and then so that you can find a rich guy and get married and settle down. And that's called a mansoek degree. And this is colloquially speaking. Sometimes these things, we still say these things. So it's not necessarily a racial problem. It's a societal problem, and it manifests itself across all classes, all races. So even rich communities or rich men, white, have the similar situation. If you look at corporate South Africa, from a gender equality perspective, why is it predominantly white and male? That's where you start looking at this problem of gender equality. And then you look at how that then manifests itself in a more private setting. And you would see that women are always relegated to subordinates instead of them being treated as equals. And then that translates itself into the workplace, it translates itself into the community, and it then ultimately translates itself into the household. So lobola itself is a very contested subject, and some people don't regard it as an exchange or a commodification of you are buying a bride. Some people see it as, in fact, I think the most consistent description of lobola is that it's not buying a bride. It's actually of two families coming together and celebrating that and exchanging gifts and so on. And so, in fact, it's a form of customary marriage. In other communities, you have the dowry system. People where sometimes it's the male that approach a family, the female that approaches the male's family and pays for the wedding. But still, you have gender-based violence in those communities. So it's really not specific to a particular race. It's a pandemic, like COVID-19. Gender-based violence is indiscriminate. It literally is part of something very wrong in our makeup as society. And that's why you correctly said in your introduction, it's not unique to South Africa. It's something that's prevalent all across the world.
Absolutely. Tell me, how far are we now as a country in terms of winning this war, winning this battle? I think we're at a point where women are getting tired, and we're seeing women now wanting to retaliate and fight because they are in turn angry, at this whole thing. How far are we as the government working hand in hand with the entire society? As you said, it's not just the government's job, but also us as a society to work together with the government. How far is the government in helping society to work together with the government in moving forward in fighting this battle?
Oh, that's a good question, but also very difficult to answer. How far we are, unlike COVID-19 or any other disease, it's not like we have a vaccine for this one where we can start injecting people and making them more gender sensitive and less patriarchal. But how you can evaluate government, I'm not sure how to evaluate society's evolution about this. But we're getting there so far as ensuring that in some spaces, firstly, we really entrench the 50-50 principle, right? So if you look at some structures in society, you would want to see higher levels of female representation, because that's where we should start looking at this thing, the fact that we should start idolizing certain women heroines as well and their contribution to where we are. Those are part of the societal programs that we should really start elevating a lot more. But in terms of assessing government and where it is in its response to gender-based violence, I would really encourage people to look at the plans that government says it has. So the National Strategic Plan Against Gender-Based Violence, what did we say we will do and how far we are in doing that? Also the laws that we've put in place, the Domestic Violence Amendment Bill, the Criminal Sexual Amendment Act, and the National Sexual Register of Sexual Offences Act as well. Those are like the broad strokes and the intentions of government to deal with gender-based violence, and that's what we should at least, when evaluating government, to say, okay, when these incidences do occur because of our own social failings, how does the government then respond? And I think that would be an accurate way of assessing government.
Yeah. Are we safe? Because I think one concern that we have as women is me running down to the police station and saying that, no, I've come to open a case. This gentleman is beating me or is being abusive in some way or the other. And you find that either the docket will get lost or you will not get much help from the police. What is government doing in creating awareness and in teaching and empowering our police force to actually, be on our side in terms of protecting us as women? Because sometimes you find that someone says, I went to the police, but they are friends. They drink together on a Friday. So a bribe will just somehow make the docket disappear? What measures are put in place to ensure that bribes are not part of, protecting women and any other way of devaluing the system?
Yeah. So that's actually a general problem of the criminal justice
Yes,
system.
yes,
Uh, Regardless of what crime it is,
yes.
there is that random possibility of a docket disappearing. And so one of the
Mm.
things that we're very strong about in this administration is introducing IT reforms in the criminal justice system and modernizing it. So one of the things that we have piloted at various police stations now is the idea of an e-docket, which essentially means you open it on the system and it shows you an audit of who is handling this matter. So if Crispin is handling this matter, and then he passes it on to Prosecutor Ginger, there's an audit trail of what has happened to this docket and actually exactly where it is on the system. Those are one of the innovations that this administration in particular is introducing. And because we are finding that a number of cases, it is said that a docket has disappeared and then that becomes the end of a matter. But also professionalizing the police so that they are able to respond with the required level of empathy when someone comes, and that they are actually required to deal with the matter in a matter which is conducive. So what you don't want is for Chris to go to a police station and say, "Ungishayele uchinja," and then they say, "Hi, hambani niyoxoxa, hambani
Yeah,
niyoyilungisa,"
yeah.
which is common.
Mm.
That's also because police are a product of our own communities. That response is a response that you'd also get, ironically, from a family member that you trust. And that's also at that level where we need to start saying, even to family members, if a relative comes to you and says, "This is the problem in my relationship," the answer is not no, hambani niyoxoxa, uyabambezela, those type of things. We need to get rid of those sort of comments and really start saying, okay, this is a safe space. Stay here for a couple of days and maybe we can find some other level of intervention. So even at a policing level, those are the type of things that we really want to start hearing less of. We don't want people who come to our police stations to be turned away because the police officer said no. He loves you or something like that. It's a difficult road to follow, that one. I think it's not going to be something that happens overnight. I personally have had experiences with the criminal justice system where I come to really appreciate this, and I'm a male, so I cannot imagine what it would be for a woman interacting with our criminal justice system. But these are the things that we really, as this administration, are looking more closely at getting right. So in some places where we've seen hotspots of gender-based violence, you're starting to have specialist gender-based violence units in those police stations, where you would be
Okay.
then dealing with social workers, if possible, and specialists instead of dealing with a traditional police officer. So like in the area of Deep Sluit, we have such a facility. And I would encourage you, Ginger, maybe you should go have a look one day to see that this is what government is doing. And right there next door is a clinic, if needs be, and then also social work specialists, social worker specialists are also within the space to really deal with the psychological issues. But of course, this requires a great number of resources, which are not infinite, unfortunately. In my language, my principal likes saying, which means the head of a family all eat the head of a locust. So we all have to share this very little small
Thing.
to the society to the best of our ability. And of course, cutting down on matters like corruption is really important so that we can really oil the criminal justice machinery properly and so that we're able to respond to these type of challenges in our communities.
Okay. So the number that you gave us, the 0800 428 428, is it the same number that I can use or any of our viewers can use if we spot our neighbor or someone that we know who's actually going through a tough time where they are victims of gender-based violence, but they are not ready to talk about it? Does government also cater for such cases, and can that be reported?
One of the debates, interestingly, that we introduced through the Domestic Violence Amendment Bill is actually that an obligation on someone else to report a matter of gender-based violence, because despite our high walls in our communities, we do hear, or we do sometimes see,
Absolutely.
people getting beaten up, and we now need to start saying as a society, should we just look the other way and say, no, it's not my problem? And so we introduced such a measure through the Domestic Violence Amendment Bill. My understanding that it got debated quite hotly by various sectors of society. Some have argued that maybe it could be a bit unconstitutional because you shouldn't impose a duty on people to report such issues. But we will see how Parliament responds to that introduction. But yes, I think you can use this number to report a crime that you see, a gender-based violence crime that you see. But also you can call the police generally when a crime is being committed, because assault, in the very first instance, beating up someone is assault.
Absolutely.
So you should be able to report that as a crime. You don't have to be specific to say, I'm reporting gender-based violence, but you can say someone is being beaten up by someone else, and I think that's a crime of assault, and the police should investigate it. So that 10-1 could also work.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Crispin, for your time. We really truly appreciate this and what we've heard that the government is doing. I've read quite a number of articles to show the initiatives that the government is putting out there. It's a pity that, as like you say, it's a small locust where there are not much resources, but everyone has to eat out of it. I hope and I pray that at some point we will get to a point where it is so evident that even the man on the streets can see what the government is doing in order to eradicate gender-based violence in society, because it was one pandemic that really seems to be, tripling. It's just going on and on. It's such a bad. And I'm grateful that you came to our show today. Thank you so much for sharing. Maybe there's one thing that you'd like to say to our viewers concerning gender-based violence as a part of concluding our conversation.
No, thank you very much, Ginger. I enjoyed the interview, but I really hope that from this conversation, we can continue to galvanize all of our communities to really reflect deeply about gender-based violence in your own corner, shine the light. And it's not something that government can solve. That's something that we must disabuse ourselves of. It's something that we all need to collectively much like COVID, you need to wash your hands, you need to sanitize, and you need to wear a mask. With gender-based violence as well, we need to be constantly conscious about your male privilege if you're a male. And you need to constantly understand that you're not entitled to a woman's body at any point. And also that you just need to treat people as equal. And if you're not going to be able to do that to some human being, then you should not do it. If you're not going to do that, then you should not do it to another human. I think if we can live by the principles, our society would be a better place in general.
Okay. Thank you so much, Crispin, for coming through. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the show, but we are so happy as Ginger the Voice to have had Crispin in our conversation today to tell us that gender-based violence, as much as it's prevalent in South Africa, but it is something that the government is doing something about. They're fighting it and they're making sure that it comes to an end. Therefore, we need to hold hands with the government and work together as the South African society to say no to gender-based violence, no to undermining other people, and to know that we're all equal in the sight of God. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience even from yesterday. Ginger the Voice is very excited to tell you that next week we have our show back on our normal time slot, which is Wednesday, 7 o'clock. Thank you so much for coming through. I truly appreciate this. My name is Ginger, the founder of Ginger the Voice, and we're a communications company that seeks to give hope, courage, and enlightenment. We do this through various platforms such as speaking, singing, and hosting talk shows. We'll see you same time, same place. Good night.